were not just aristocratic residences, they were centers of military, political, and legal power. They functioned as impenetrable fortresses that granted authority to the feudal lord and strictly controlled the lives of all those who lived in their domains. In its closed chambers, underground prisons, and audit rooms, a system of punishments, tortures, taxes, and coercions developed that permeated the daily lives of the serfs. This dark side, rarely portrayed in entertainment works, reveals a face of feudalism marked by the systematic use of force and fear as instruments of government. From the moment they appeared, castles represented centers of absolute control. They were strategically positioned on hills, rivers, or borders, allowing the lord to observe and dominate the surrounding lands. They did not only have a defensive function, they were physical projections of feudal power, constantly reminding the peasants who held the highest authority. Within these structures, vital decisions were made. Tax collections, trials, territorial administration, punishments, and the organization of militia. For many servants, entering the castle was not a reason for admiration, but for fear. It was there that their fate was defined. Disputes were resolved, and sentences were meted out, not always fair or moderate. Feudal taxes were one of the most oppressive forms of control over the rural population. It was not enough for the serf to work long hours on the master's land. He was also required to pay a series of fees, many of them arbitrary and deeply onerous. There were taxes on the use of mills, bridges, and furnaces, all of which belonged to the lord. There were fees for marriages, for inheritances, for moving residence, and even for the possession of domestic animals. In some fiefdoms, one had to pay for minimum permits, such as collecting timber, grazing cattle, or fishing in local rivers. These tributes guaranteed the feudal lord an enormous accumulation of resources, but left the peasants constantly on the brink of destitution. The collection was made inside the castle, where manorial agents evaluated productions and demanded payments. Any dispute, delay, or failure could result in severe punishments. Feudal justice was another fundamental mechanism of control. In many regions, the feudal lord had almost absolute legal rights within his territory. This meant that he could adjudicate disputes, punish crimes, and enforce laws based on local traditions. While some rules attempted to limit abuse, the reality is that the judicial process largely depended on the master's will. He could, for example, impose disproportionate fines, demand additional services, or even confiscate land in extreme cases. Justice was seen as part of its natural authority, rather than as an impartial system aimed at the common good. Peasants and serfs hardly had a chance to challenge decisions, as they did not have the resources, influence, or legal knowledge to defend themselves. It is within this context that the torture chambers and underground prisons of feudal castles appear. Although not all masters used torture as a regular practice, it was considered a legitimate instrument of investigation and punishment. Damp rooms, narrow chambers, and dark dungeons were part of the architecture of many castles. The justification for torture was often related to the extraction of confessions, the control of behavior, and public example. It was an extreme way to consolidate authority and intimidate anyone who dared to challenge the established order. The vision of the castle as a place of justice was mixed with the idea of physical punishment, and this combination reinforced the fear that sustained much of the feudal power. Among the forms of torture employed were stretching, which consisted of attaching a person to mechanisms that pulled their limbs to the limit, crushing used to destroy bones and joints, and prolonged confinement in dark and unhealthy chambers, which often led to death from disease or starvation. In some castles, there were underground pits where prisoners were abandoned with little food and no hygiene. The intention was clear: to break the physical and psychological resistance of those who represented a threat to order. Although these penalties were officially applied only to criminals or enemies, the line between justice and abuse was thin, and serfs could be subject to disproportionate punishments for minor infractions, such as failing to pay taxes, disobeying orders, or contesting seigneurial rights. Physical control was not the only mechanism used within castles. Psychological control played an equally important role. The constant presence of the keep the highest and most fortified point of the castle functioned as a visual symbol of seigneurial power. From almost any part of the fief, the peasants could see this towering tower, a permanent reminder that they were under surveillance and authority. In addition, public ceremonies were held in the inner courtyard, where the Lord demonstrated his strength by punishing offenders in front of everyone. This theater of power reinforced collective submission and weakened any attempt at resistance. It is necessary to contextualize, however, that the feudal castle was not just a place of oppression. He had multiple functions. It was also an administrative center, a place for food storage, a shelter in times of war, and a symbol of territorial unity. However, these positive aspects do not cancel out the fact that for a large part of the rural population, the castle represented more control than protection. It was the house of the Lord, not of the people, and the Lord, with his legal, economic, and military rights, had enough autonomy to transform the castle into a machine of almost unquestionable domination. As the centuries passed, the feudal system began to change. The growth of cities, increased trade, and the monetization of the economy weakened the absolute power of feudal lords, merchants, bourgeois, and autonomous cities began to compete with castles, offering new economic and social opportunities. This gave the peasants alternatives that did not exist before. At the same time, centralized kings and states began to limit seigneurial rights, creating more organized justice systems and reducing abuses. Torture, although still present in many European courts, was progressively questioned by thinkers, religious, and jurists. Feudal fortresses, once essential for territorial defense, lost military relevance with the emergence of gunpowder and heavy artillery. Even so, the dark legacy of feudal castles remained. They became symbols of a time when power was exercised by force, fear, and hereditary authority. They represent the duality of feudalism, while providing protection in difficult times. They kept millions of people bound by rigid obligations and dependent on arbitrary decisions. The glamorous image of castles, cultivated by novels and films, is an incomplete reflection of their true historical function. Behind the immense walls, there was human suffering, deep inequalities, and stories of pain that are rarely told. Understanding this dark face is essential to understanding the complexity of the medieval world. Feudalism was not just a system of economic obligations. It was a system of social control, legitimized by traditions, religiosity, and legal structures that preserved inequalities for centuries. Castles, at once impressive works of engineering and instruments of power, epitomize this reality. They show that history should not be analyzed only by its surface, but also by what lurks within its stones in the dark. Narrow corridors and makeshift courtrooms that have shaped the fate of so many lives. Today, when visiting medieval ruins and fortresses, many see only architectural beauty and aesthetic grandeur. Few imagine that there, behind those walls, a complex system of domination and fear was unfolding. Revisiting the dark side of feudal castles does not mean denying their historical value, but recognizing that the society they sustained was fraught with contradictions, tensions, and castles were not just stone fortresses. They were living structures that breathed power, and that power often crushed those who lived under its shadow.